science is defined sometimes as a study of the nature of the mind.
Yes.
And in some cases it's understood as the investigation of knowledge. What exactly is cognitive psychology?
When most people think of psychology, they really think of disorders or difficulties or social issues. So cognitive psychology or cognitive science really addresses what we call cognitive functions.
Okay.
So how do we perceive objects around us? How do we navigate space? How do we remember what we did yesterday versus what we did 5 years ago? Or how we might even retrieve knowledge,
Okay.
how we might reason, or how we might use language.
But cognitive psychology encompasses not just retrieval and storage of information, but also these days it involves aspects of existence like anthropology, computer science, and so
Yes.
many other things. Why?
Computer science is a very good example that you actually selected, because if you look at the terminology we use to describe computer functions, a lot of them involve storage,
Okay.
retrieval,
Okay.
erasure of information, and we think of memory in the same way, that we've forgotten something, we've stored something. So that's one of the natural connections between computer science and psychology, particularly cognitive psychology,
Okay.
and why the terms begin to overlap between the two.
Okay. What importance does memory have in cognitive psychology? Is memory the core of everything there, or is it just a part of understanding knowledge management or knowledge investigation?
Memory serves a very major role in life.
Okay.
So it is something that connects us to our past. It is something that connects us to our future. People plan based on what they have done, where they have been, where they plan to go. So it serves as a connection or a thread across one's lifespan, across history, in fact. You know,
Okay.
we store information from history, we pass it on, either verbally or in written documents or in very formal written documents. So memory serves a very fundamental function in life, and that's reflected in the way we study the function of memory within the broad spectrum of cognitive science.
Till the advent of psychiatry, psychology was understood as the art of understanding
Yes.
mind and the soul. But now with psychiatry and the treatment of patients with disorders, with medicines, and with the advent of modern psychology and now cognitive psychology, don't you think that you are actually trying to bring it down to empirical terms, like something that's more measurable, like memory and behavioral patterns and so on, and probably the essence of psychology is lost in the whole process?
To the contrary, I think the essence of psychology is finally being brought to the center of our understanding.
How?
Because it's very interesting you mentioned that psychology was understood as an art that investigated the mysteries of mind.
Okay.
Mysteries can be understood only so far when we use speculation or introspection or even debate. But at the end of the day, we have to test all of those ideas, because
you have
otherwise
to test it all, because some things may not, some testing methods may not have evolved to such an extent to actually test some things. Probably you are testing something with your limited testing abilities, and probably, if at all, the thing that you are proposing to test doesn't fall under the purview of the limitations of the testing methods, then probably that you ultimately might debunk it by saying that it's a myth, or
yes. In the study of mind, that is the greatest challenge, because it is the greatest mystery, how the mind works. But to say that it is difficult to test, therefore what would be the point, is not going to take us forward.
But could it also be that, because mind was not available, at least till very recently, to verification or testing. And nowadays these testing methods have been brought in only to bring some semblance of credibility to psychology.
I think that's a very good skeptical way of questioning the entire enterprise.
Okay.
And questioning is good because it keeps scientists on their toes, and scientists question themselves perhaps more than people who are not doing this business. But without investigation, without proving ourselves wrong, it is difficult to, it is not even possible to know whether we are headed in the right direction to understand these issues.
But for a very long time, of course, mind was not understood at all. It was a mystery, and still it has remained a mystery to a very large extent. And it's also this suspicion that most of these psychologists develop cognitive psychology only to find a way to at least define mind to an extent.
I would use an analogy here to really address the issue of the enormity of this enterprise. We are very eager to understand the universe. So that is almost at the other end of the continuum from our own mind, which is internal to us. So yes, this is a very difficult goal to set up for ourselves to investigate, but it is the most fascinating challenge.
But why hasn't it been possible, even with cognitive psychology, to define mind in any way that any man or woman or person existing with the awareness of a mind has been able to accept the definition?
To begin with, mind is a very large concept, and that is where...
But don't you think that itself is quite defeatist?
No, in fact,
it is recognizing it's too large, it's abstract, and so that you say, no, we'll wait for a while to define it. We'll talk about other things.
I think it's very important to understand the magnitude of the problem that you're trying to investigate. And one of the very important functions that a field like cognitive science serves is to recognize the magnitude and find ways of making it manageable. And that's why we break down the functions of the mind into very broad categories like language, memory, attention, reasoning, intelligence to some extent within this broad spectrum. And once we start recognizing that our mind is involved or subsumes all these major functions, and then we take each of these functions and start studying each of these in depth, we are obviously taking the reductionist approach that science does take. And when you take a reductionist approach, you do lose certain epiphenomenal properties that make up what we call the mind. But we then do make it something that we can study.
Because mind is integral to everything that is to human existence. But still, like we have not even been able to surmount even 1/10 of the height that we are supposed to reach. And don't you think it's such a big challenge to even forget about the ordinary psychologists or psychiatrists, like at least the cognitive psychologists who've been able to at least, fathom things in a different way?
Yes, we are.
But are they all aware of such a challenge that's in front of them?
Without a doubt.
That to be able to talk about as if they know about the mind by not even exactly knowing what it is and how it is, and still in the process of understanding things.
Without a doubt, cognitive scientists understand the magnitude of the problem that they are studying, and that's one of the reasons why the field is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary. So earlier you brought up the point of how is it that computer science and cognitive psychology and neuroscience and neurology and psychiatry are interconnected in so many ways. It is because scientists working in all these different fields recognize that there is not one single way to understand a problem that is as mysterious, deep, and enormous as understanding the human mind.
But there is also this complaint that cognitive psychologists depend too much on statistics and experiments. What do you have to react to that?
It is statistics and experimentation are two of the most beautiful tools we have to understand.
But statistics have this fantastic feature of being wrong most of the times, right?
Statistics is probabilistic,
Yeah.
and when you're working with probability, we know that there is a certain chance that we would be wrong.
Okay.
But then it tells us the extent to which we could be on the right track.
Okay.
It's a very smart way of approaching.
Because human behavior is transient and people keep changing, and people also in cognitive psychology itself, that you've understood very well, that people react in different ways in different environments. So how does experimenting work at all? Because you are experimenting under set situations and
Yes.
circumstances,
Yes.
and in a certain environment.
Yes.
So probably the results that you get in a lab would be entirely different from what it could be in the open, whereas where the same person would be in a different environment or
I'm very glad you
situation.
raised this issue, because this issue is not unique to cognitive science,
Okay.
cognitive psychology, or for that matter, any aspect of psychology.
Okay.
This is true of any science. We have to bring, whether it's physics, chemistry, or any other discipline, we have to bring the phenomenon into the laboratory so that we can understand, we can control the parameters that might be affecting the phenomenon. After controlling,
in a controlled environment, don't you think that the results would also be predetermined to an extent?
the results,
That if with this kind of what do you say, mind
Outcome might
can
happen.
react in this way, and
I would
probably
put
that
it differently. I would say that we are in a much stronger position to draw inferences that are likely to be correct and to draw
likely
causal
to be,
relations.
what is the percentage of the likelihood?
Well, that's where statistics comes in. You test 30 people on a particular in a particular experiment, and you estimate statistically how many are performing in a particular way.
But don't you also think that probably you psychologists could be very wrong sometimes?
Who is not wrong?
But don't you think it's quite scary when it happens in the lab of a cognitive psychologist?
Well, that's why we have something called replication.
Okay.
There is not a single experiment where we get something very interesting, potentially very important and informative that just stands as a single experiment. It's always a series of experiments that converge on a particular outcome. So in that fashion, it's science the way it is applied in any discipline that we apply in cognitive psychology.
What essentially are cognitive functions?
Well, we've been having a very interesting conversation right now. And if you break it down, there are so many different components that are going into this conversation. The very first is the ability that we both have to use language.
Okay.
So that's a very, some may argue, very specialized cognitive function,
Okay.
because we think that humans are unique in being able to use language to this
Okay.
extent. That's under debate, but nevertheless, that is one major cognitive function that we can immediately identify that makes this communication possible. And then we are keeping track of what we discussed 10 minutes ago,
Okay.
and we are planning what we might be in each of our own minds, what we might be discussing 10 minutes from now. So there is a lot of planning, a lot of strategy. Those are cognitive functions, and there's a lot of memory
Okay.
in keeping track of all that. So each of these are cognitive functions that make communication possible.
So it's basically the cognitive functions are to do with communication alone, in terms of information and communication, or it's also to do with some other psychobiological functions which you speak about?
Communication would be one major example, but you have picked on a very important aspect of what cognitive scientists and neuroscientists are very busy studying these days, and that is the underlying neurological, neurophysiological, or even biological components that might be influencing the way we think, the way we remember, and the way we function in the world. So communication is one aspect, but how we get through our jobs, through the day, it involves every cognitive function at one point or another that we bring to bear on it. How did we get from our respective homes to the studio today? It involves remembering spatial relationships, navigating through that. So all of our day-to-day functioning is composed of, we think of it being composed of emotion, intelligence, but putting it all together are these cognitive functions that make us bring all of it to fruition.
You've been specializing in understanding memory. What important a role does memory play in understanding the cognitive functions of the mind?
Memory is one of the major components, or one of the major cognitive functions that we have. So one way
normally memory is understood as storage and retrieval of information.
Yes.
And also memory is supposed to be sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
But what is this implicit memory and explicit memory?
The earlier models of memory distinguished between what you correctly just pointed out as three major types. Sensory, where just the information that comes in very, very temporarily we store, and short term.
That could also be understood as short-term memory. Why do you say it's sensory? For instance, you know, like I think there was this experiment to show some words for just 1/10 a second to people, and like, you know, you would, and there were so many people who could remember when there was an auditory what do you say, signal.
Yes.
But how that is different from
short-term memory? Well, for one thing, the experiment that you just described involves retention of that information for about a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds. Whereas short-term memory, depending on the particular type of information.
Why is it called sensory? Because, you know, it's attached to the senses.
It is very
auditory and visual.
That's right. It's very sensory in nature, and if it came in through the auditory channel or the visual channel, there is not enough time to transform it to a more abstract level of representation. So if it is presented visually and suddenly we mask that information, people are not going to be able to report that information.
Then do you think that if somebody can actually master the art of memorizing things in a sensorial manner, then he or she can actually just have this photographic memory, that you can just look at things and just remember?
Sensory memory is something that all of us have at our disposal, and all of us are able to display. But it is not so much utilization. It is something that we probably use all the time. When we are reading, we are jumping from one word to another very rapidly, and it's probably the sensory memory that's providing the transition as we rapidly scan through the page. But
it's basically that, you know, like, it's time for us to understand that you don't have to wait at a word and try to digest it.
That's right.
But the mind has its own way of, you know, taking information, which we probably have not recognized.
Well, that's what cognitive scientists are demonstrating. That there
are you telling this to the people also, or only that you people have understood this?
Well, a show like yours is very useful in being able to tell people that this is how our ability to read can be understood, because there's so many levels at which we are bringing.
There is so much information that you're gathering and inferring, but are you also trying towards applying it, trying to devise methods for applicability of such wealth of knowledge that you're getting out of your experiments?
Well, there are two branches of this discipline. One is basic and one is applied. And so basic scientists are discovering all these properties, principles, and these fundamental processes that all of us use. And applied cognitive scientists, particularly those who are involved in studying human factors. So how is it that knowing all these fundamental principles, we can use it, for example, in the cockpit?
Okay.
where there is this influx of information. How can we use it in the workplace so that the work environment is designed to optimally utilize these functions? So there is definitely an applied branch. I do want to go back though to an earlier distinction that you asked me about, that of implicit versus explicit memory. That is a distinction that came to be understood very dramatically about 2 or 2.5 decades ago, when cognitive psychologists started studying the disorder of amnesia. The way this whole distinction came to the forefront was by the discovery that even though people, after they become amnesic, and that is to say that they are unable to remember what they did this morning, even though they might be able to very well describe what they did when they were 5 years old or when they were in college, but since the onset of this amnesia, they are unable to describe or retain incoming information.
Okay.
Well, that is the general belief, and that is the general behavior where amnesic individuals cannot report what they did or what they learned in the ongoing day. But if they are probed indirectly, so if they're given a task that utilizes information that they did learn, they're able to demonstrate memory for it in doing that task. So there is something implicitly that they have retained.
That means implicit learning happens no matter what. Whether you consciously record your learning or not, the learning happens.
It is under debate whether the nature of that learning is the same as when you have conscious access to it. Although that's under debate, it is very well documented that implicit learning happens, whether or not we recognize it. And this is not true only for people who've become amnesic. It's true for you, it's true for me.
How do people remember things? And why do people forget things?
Why do people forget things is almost a more interesting question, I would imagine, to our viewership as well, because people really worry about why they forget as much as they do. Well, I have good news. Forgetting serves a very important function. Because, well, you don't want to remember every painful event of your life. It is good for it to fade and recede, so that we can function, normally in a healthy way and in a happy way, hopefully. And it is also useful because we live in an environment that has so much information overload. So in order to manage what we need to manage efficiently, it is adaptive to forget some things that are not so useful anymore.
But don't you think it's like it is difficult to remember some things deliberately? It is as difficult to even forget things if you really want to forget some things. And like they say, the more you want to forget something, the more you retain the information. The more you want to remember something, the more you forget it.
That's very true.
Why does it happen?
Because there's a very fundamental memory principle that underlies the dilemma that you just described. The more we want to forget something, the more we bring it to mind by telling ourselves we need to forget it. And by doing so, we are rehearsing it. So by rehearsing it, we are repeating the purpose. That's right.
But what about at the same time wanting to remember something and forgetting?
Well, that is more complex, of course. Sometimes we forget because we have too much to remember. Often we forget because we have too much to remember.
How is it in some cases people forget the most important thing and remember everything else?
It seems that way when we do forget something that's of importance.
Like, you would have even made a note of it. You would have told everything about it. Like, somebody, he would wake up for every other reason in the morning, but the day he's supposed to catch the train, he wakes up late.
Well, what I can suggest is when people go through that experience, they should track how often they forget unimportant things. And they will discover that they forget unimportant things more often than they forget important things.
So it's not an extraordinary thing to forget?
No, it is not at all extraordinary. And forgetting important things is not more likely. In fact, it's less likely. But when it happens, we notice that.
Is it also true that with age that you become more forgetful?
That is definitely the general perception.
Okay.
People say they have senior moments
Okay.
when they are unable to remember things that they fully intended to remember. And it is true that with age, there is some forgetting, and it's normal. It's nothing to worry about. In the normal course of things, you know, every other function declines when we age. So there is nothing unique about, you know, having some forgetfulness. That's very common. We also have to remember that as we age, we have much more to remember.
Okay.
So when we have much more to remember,
Yeah.
percentage-wise, we are not
Okay.
forgetting as
that's
much.
a very positive
But
thing.
it just feels that way. And I think once we recognize that this is a normal
Okay.
course of things, then I think people are going to be less worried. And if they're less worried, they're less likely to forget.
Yeah, but when we talk about memory, we also speak about psychological disorders. Are they actually disorders or disturbances? Because it's very easy for us to brand something as a disorder. Could it be just the disturbance that sometimes is understood as a disorder, and, you know?
I think you're right, this is a matter of terminology. And I think terminology comes into existence because it serves a certain purpose.
Okay.
And when we talk about it as a disorder,
No, the
in
moment you
common-
tell somebody you have a
Yes.
memory disorder,
yes,
it is more difficult for
Yes.
somebody to cope with
That's-
than when you say you have a disturbance. Like your memory has been disturbed, probably, which can be set right. Then it's much easier for a common man to handle it.
you are absolutely correct. I think how we present a problem can definitely influence how people are able to cope with it.
Okay.
But if there is a disorder that is fairly substantial,
Mm.
I think it is important to recognize it that way, because
Okay.
we make proper adjustment
Okay.
once we recognize it.
But are there ways to improve one's memory to bring it to the optimum level?
There are
Is
na-
there something called optimum, memory level at all?
I think the optimum level for each individual would be defined
Okay,
differently
okay.
Within the context of their own lifestyle,
Mm.
their own ability, and their own goals.
Okay.
And I think keeping one's own goals
Yes.
in perspective is very important. And there are definitely ways to improve memory. There are strategies, there are mnemonic techniques, there are methods, and all of those are useful. And the most important thing to keep in mind is to keep one's goals in mind.
Dr. Rajaram, you certainly, like you mentioned earlier, not in this context but elsewhere, you're not actually as young as you look. You've been in this profession for over 18 years now.
That's correct.
After you went from India after completing MA in psychology, you've been in the US for about 18,
That's
19
correct.
years.
That's
And you've been also teaching cognitive psychology.
Yes.
You've been teaching postgraduate students, graduate school, and you've been doing a lot of work. You're a recognized person. Your students also like you very much. And some of them also have been writing about how much they like your work. But where do you think that your work has been unique?
There are two areas that I'd like to identify, and I hope that those who are interested in this field would find this kind of information useful. In terms of, so the two areas, one I would like to identify in my research, and the other I would like to identify as my professional contribution that goes beyond research. In research, one of the very favorite lines of work that I've been doing that I hope has contributed to the field is the empirical demonstration.
Okay.
That what we experience as subjective memories that seem very personal and very different from just pure knowledge, but something that we call the experiencing of the past, can actually be objectively measured. And it can be distinguished from knowledge, because that's what makes life and living so unique.
Yes.
And so personal. So in terms of research, that is something that I identify as a very favorite line of my work, and my efforts to demonstrate that what we learn implicitly can actually be put to use, whether or not we are aware of it. But in terms of my professional contributions, I've been engaged in a lot of editorial responsibilities. I'm currently an associate editor of a review journal called Psychological Bulletin. And prior to that, I was an associate editor of a journal, an empirical journal.
Okay.
So in that capacity, I'm able to, well, my job is to review papers that are submitted and determine whether they cross the threshold. But a very important and gratifying part of that job is to actually give feedback and direction to younger investigators who are getting into the business and giving them feedback in ways that they can improve what they're doing.
Dr. Suparna Rajaram, I'm sure that you're doing a great work, and I'm sure you have a great future too, and you've made a name for yourself, and also you've been contributing a lot to the society, and probably people might be able to benefit a lot in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.